Well, good morning everyone and welcome back to the shop. So if you've watched the previous videos, of course one of them had a little bit of a modification to it where we ran into some challenges on centering the bell housing. It turns out we had done a lot of effort for no reason. The bell housing actually bolted on, and when we did the run out, we were about 4/1000th of an inch out at worst, and again 5/1000th is acceptable. So all that's behind us, so let's move forward. So the next step in the process is to put the clutch onto the flywheel. Now, before I do anything, what I like to do is I'll get some heavy grease. I like to use a heavy grease, and I get it on my finger here, and I get it inside of the pilot bearing, and just put some grease in there, because even though 99% of the time the pilot bearing and the input shaft are spinning at exactly the same speed, when you're either in neutral or when you have your foot on the clutch, the input shaft isn't spinning, and of course the flywheel is, because your engine's running, and therefore there will be some friction between the two. So you want to put a little bit of grease. You don't want to use oil or anything, because oil will run, right? The grease at least stays where you put it, and you want to use like a high temperature grease. I like to use wheel bearing grease because it's not going to go anywhere, even when it gets hot. And the idea now is it'll just stay in here to keep the input shaft. Now, while my gloves are dirty, I am now going to go and put a little bit of the same grease on the input shaft where the throwout bearing runs, right? So we want to put some there, so let's go do that. Okay, so now why am I doing this? Because we have to lubricate this area, because this is where the throwout bearing slides back and forth. So as the clutch is depressed, the throwout bearing moves forward, disengages the clutch, and then when it falls back, the clutch engages, and off you go. So you want to make sure that that area is nice and smooth. Again, you don't want to use an oil, because oil will eventually drip off. You want to use something that, again, as I mentioned, is going to stay here, because you don't want to get any contamination on that disc. So anyways, let's get back to the engine. Okay, so before we get started putting all this together, this is the clutch kit I bought. It is a 10.5 inch clutch. Remember, 157 tooth. It has a certain diameter, and it can only manage a 10.5 inch clutch. So you have to make sure that you get the appropriate clutch. If you're running a larger clutch, I mean, obviously that's the bigger block, which means it would be the 164 tooth flywheel, but in this case here, it is the 10.5. Now the 10.5 comes with a whole bunch of things, or the kit does, and of course it comes with the pressure plate. Underneath it is the friction disc, and of course it came with the throwout bearing, and it came with the pilot bearing, and of course you know the pilot bearing is already put in. It also comes with a tool, or I guess an alignment tool, that when I put this all together, I can use this to center the disc into the center of the clutch. The reason is because when I try to stab the transmission in, and that input shaft comes into the flywheel, not only does it have to go in through the friction disc, but then that has to go into the pilot bearing, and if you don't have that aligned, you know, you'll be there all day trying to get that done. So at least it comes with all the things we need. So what I'm going to do is I am going to clean the flywheel, make sure that it's clean. I'm then going to clean the surface of the the pressure plate, because these sometimes come with a non-rust spray, something just to kind of seal the steel surface, and you got to get that off, right? So I'm going to be cleaning the flywheel, cleaning the pressure plate, and then we can put this together. So I'm just going to use some brake cleaner, but if you have any acetone or something, I mean, you just want something that's going to be able to cut through the grease. So we want to be able to spray this down and clean that surface off. And like I said, that has a high evaporation rate. So there we go. So we clean the surface of the flywheel off. I'm going to clean the surface of the pressure plate off, and then we'll put this together. Okay, so the surfaces are all clean. I use brake cleaner on both the pressure plate and the flywheel. So now you take your friction disc. I find this the easiest way. Take the friction disc and place it inside of the pressure plate. Now, always make sure, you'll see on the pressure plate, there's a side that's got an extended amount of springs on it, and then a side that's fairly flat. That fairly flat is going against your flywheel, right? This does not go into the flywheel, right? And you'll figure that out. But basically this goes together like that, and then we take this and we're going to place it up against the flywheel. There are locating dowels on the pressure plate, and those location dowels are already on the flywheel. That should at least let you get it oriented so that you can then start to thread the bolts in. Of course, I've got my blue Loctite ready to go on the bolts. They bolt down to about 35 foot-pounds of torque. And of course, they have lock washers on them as well. So they shouldn't go anywhere either. But like I said, I'd rather have it harder to take apart years from now than coming apart on its own, right? So that's the key. All right, so I'm just going to lift this in place, and let's go to the next step. Okay, the reason I did that without you seeing is just simply because I would have my back to the camera when I was doing it. You wouldn't see it anyways. But basically, the 3 locating dowels hold the pressure plate onto the flywheel. Now, I am not applying any pressure with my hand. I'm just holding it in case I just don't want this falling off. But basically now, we've got it in. Of course, the friction disc moves, right? But we're not going to center that yet. What we are going to start doing now is taking the nuts, applying some Loctite to the bolts, and I'm going to put all the bolts into the bolt circle. Okay, so the Loctites are on the thread. All of the bolts have been bolted in, but they are just finger tight. Like you can see, I can rotate this, and as soon as it touches, I stop. The reason is I need this friction disc to still be able to move around, because I now need to take the alignment tool and insert it to get this centered, because we have to make sure that this friction disc is centered. Now, another way to check for center, because sometimes I don't get this alignment tool. So what I do is there are spots here with inside of the pressure plate that you can actually see the friction disc. And I can feel the friction disc is just a few millimeters smaller than the diameter of the pressure plate. So if that distance is the same all the way around, and I can feel it with my fingers, then we've pretty well centered the friction disc with inside. But again, these tools are fantastic. So now step 2, we want to bolt this down. Now we're not going to start torquing right away. You don't want to torque this one down now. What you want to do is take a simple ratchet, and then on each of these, maybe give them a couple of cranks. And I like to go opposite of the ones I'm doing here. So we just, almost like a car tire, right? Where you're going to do 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to come over 1, and again 1, 2, 3, and this one down here. And like I said, I'm just going to now go around and around and around until the pressure plate has made contact with the flywheel. Then we can start worrying about torque. But at this point in time, like I said, we just want to bring this flywheel in the pressure plate in as straight as possible until it makes contact, and then we start to torque down. So I'll just do that for the next couple of minutes, and then we'll be back with the torque wrench. Okay, so I just used my ratchet, and these are all now they're all bottomed out, but they are not torqued, right? They've just now got to the point where the friction disc and the pressure plate are against the flywheel. Then what I do is I just take this as one last try and make sure that goes all the way in, because that's what I'm going to have to do with the transmission, right? We're going to have to bring the transmission in, and it's got to go straight into that pilot bearing. If it doesn't, then obviously don't torque this down. Make sure that goes all the way in before you set it in place, or like I said, you'll never get the transmission in. So we're ready to torque. Have this set for 35 pounds. And again, it's just simply round robin. We're going to go across in a star pattern just to make sure that it's all bolted down nicely, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, 35 foot-pounds, lock washers, Loctite. I don't think that's going anywhere. So now we have to put the transmission on. Now there are 2 approaches. I could get my bell housing bolted on, and then with the bell housing bolted on, I would have to get the clutch fork and the throwout bearing into the bell housing with limited access, because all I'll have is the small hole on the side where the clutch fork goes, or the hole on the back where the transmission goes, to try to get all that in, and then have that sit perfectly so that when I bring the transmission, I can then stab it through a throwout bearing that is being held in the middle of the air, and then of course get inside of the transmission. I'm thinking I'm going to take the bell housing, bolt it to the transmission, get the throw bearing and the flywheel the throw bearing and the clutch fork all the way it was before, just like we've been working, and then take the whole thing and stab it in, and that way there I don't have to worry about it. I think I'm going to go do that. Okay, so bell housing is bolted back onto the transmission. Now, as I said, I put a little bit of grease on the input shaft so that the throw-up bearing would slide nice and easy. Remember, don't glob it on. This is just a surface, so you literally are rubbing it in. Now, I put a little bit of grease on my finger as well, and I just put it on the inside of the throw-up bearing as well. Just give both sides now, they're pre-greased, so they'll slide nice and easy. You'll also notice on the throw-up bearing there's a little raised edge here. Now that raised edge is on purpose. When this is together, they want that raised edge on the outside because they don't want this spinning inside of the fork. We don't want this spinning on the input shaft. We only want the throw-up bearing spinning, not the sleeve. The sleeve just goes back and forth, it doesn't spin. So we needed to be able to do that and identify that that's going to be on the outside because the clutch fork goes here. And then what I finally did here is I put a little bit of grease just on the pivot point. I mean, because this is going to be rocking, but a little bit of grease isn't going to hurt anything. And again, grease being as thick as it is, it's not going to migrate or go anywhere or get onto the clutch surface. And this is where little is more, right? You want just enough, obviously, to lubricate it, but you certainly don't want enough that you're going to make too much of a mess. All right, so we're going to put this back together the way we did before, and then we'll marry these two back together. Okay, so we have the spring in place. That's holding the throw-up bearing onto the pivot point. We're in the pivot point, and you can see that's fantastic, nice and slippery. That's not going anywhere, and it's not going to migrate any grease down into the splines and then into the clutch, right? We want to keep that lubrication back there. That's why the heavy grease, the high temperature grease, so it's not going to overheat and start to run, right? So that's exactly what we want to see. So what I'm going to do now is take this and put it over there and put the two together. So what I've done is I've just taken a little bit of the weight of the transmission off. I'm by myself and I'm going to have to move this in place. You never want to leave the transmission hanging on the input shaft. If you get this 3/4 of the way in and then you can't get it in anymore because it's binding on the clutch, take it back out. Don't just leave it hanging while you run off and try to see if you can do something. It can never hang off of that input shaft or you will hurt something. But basically this just allows me now, you can see how easy this is. It's balanced. I can swing this in and we can bring this up into the engine. And then I can marry the two parts, and then if I have to, I can move the output shaft in order to rotate the input shaft to marry it in. So let's put this together. Okay, so using the engine hoist, I was able to get the transmission in place, wiggled in just far enough that I could get the bolts started. And the bolts, again, are just hand tight. But what I'm going to be able to do now is by taking my ratchet and just giving it a couple of spins on one and then a couple of spins on another. And like I said, it's moving in freely, there's no binding. I'm going to draw the two halves back together. And again, if you had a helping hand, it'd be a little easier because you would have somebody to support the end of the transmission and start to wiggle it in order to drive the transmission in. But we're at a point now where all I need to do is, like I said, bring these in and we'll be ready to go. All right, so we have a fully assembled drivetrain as far as the engine and transmission is concerned. We've already obviously pre-measured the stab depth of the input shaft, so we know that's sitting nicely now inside of the pilot bearing. We know that we're married to the splines because I couldn't get the transmission on until I rotated the output shaft, that therefore rotated the input shaft so that the splines would match, and then I was able to wiggle it in. And as you saw, you simply start putting the bolts in and, start putting them finger tight, wiggle, finger tight. Never try to draw the two together by just the bolts. Never put the bolts in and then just, crank on the bolts to bring it together. Always wiggle it so that it starts to close the gap. And then once you get to a certain point, then the bolts just draw it together and you're done. I have obviously the clutch fork is in place, the boot is in place, so this is all ready to just have the clutch rod connected to it. But we can't do any of that until this is back into the car. So I guess the next step is we're going to put this into the car. We're going to figure out, as I mentioned earlier, make sure that the transmission fits inside the transmission tunnel, make sure that the shifter comes up through the original shifter hole, or do I have to move that? I really can't because, of course, I have a center console and that's pretty well in a fixed position. So we got to figure all of that out. Maybe I've got to turn the shifter 180 degrees again to adjust it, but we'll figure all that out later. But for now, we're done. Next step, let's get this into the car. And that'll be it. So until then, hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit that like button if you did. And I will see you next time. Take care.